All right, good evening. Welcome to Strange New World, Chapter 6, Plastic People, Liquid World. I'm going to go ahead and pray for us, and we will jump right in. Father God, I thank you so much for this time that we can spend together examining this important topic. I pray that you would enlighten our minds, give us wisdom and understanding, and please help us to have a good, profitable discussion. I pray that you would also guide our conversations and help us to figure out how to apply this material to our lives and what we should do as we interact with other human beings out there in our society. We thank you for your grace, Lord. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, Strange New World, Chapter 6, Plastic People, Liquid World. This entire chapter, to me, I think is a chapter that deals with a lot of nuance and matters of emphasis, okay? And I'm going to draw a very simple structure here that we'll return to again and again in our conversation this evening. Behold a line, a simple line. And what I'm going to suggest this evening is that there are a lot of matters of discussion in this chapter that lie on a continuum, and that there's one extreme position over here, and there's one extreme position over here, and the majority of human beings occupy somewhere in here, and we're just trying to all figure and sort out which direction, where we're at, etc. I actually found that Truman sets up a lot of dichotomies in this chapter that I don't necessarily know if I agree with, but I think the framing is helpful if you understand things as a continuum. And so, like I said, this line, this simple continuum is something that we are going to be returning to again and again. But before we do, I want to comment on the title, Plastic People, Liquid World. And he spells this out explicitly, what this Plastic People, Liquid World construction actually means on 113. He essentially says, plastic people are those who believe they can make and remake themselves at will. Plastic people can make and remake themselves at will. And the liquid world concept couples with it. A liquid world in which all that is solid seems continually to melt into air, right? All that is solid seems to continually melt into air. And so he essentially says these are the two components that make up our society, our culture, our world in which expressive individualism and the sexual revolution can reign supreme. The coupling of plastic people with a liquid world makes it to where this is just part and parcel of how we live. He also, at the outset, frames up three kind of categories that he thinks of as important. These don't line up exactly with his headings, but they're close. He calls the first the nature of personhood. The second he calls a politics of recognition. And then the third and final one is the power of imagined communities. Like I said, he has headings for each of these. He dedicates a couple of headings really to the nature of personhood and then has the other two together. And so this is going to be kind of how I walk through it. I'm going to look into each of the headings and just kind of frame up some discussions and conversations. I know I don't have a consistent format when I do these. Sometimes we're jumping into the Bible. Sometimes we don't reference the Bible at all. Sometimes I walk through and give lots of quotes. Sometimes I frame up ideas, etc. Hope you guys are okay with that eclectic approach. But tonight what I want to do is I kind of have three key ideas that I wanted to tune into, three categories that caught my attention, and I wanted to talk about each of them as they come up in the text. And so the first one is in his section called What is a Person? That's kind of the first one that he puts out there. And I just want to read a few quotes here on the What is a Person section. These are on 113 and 114. Okay, let's start with the one on 113, starting with what if. And he's doing this, thought exercise of perhaps I hadn't been born here now. Perhaps I'd been born in France in 1770. Okay, And so he has this quote, "What if I had been born in France in 1770 to a family of French nobles rather than in England in the 1960s to a family of the lower middle class? This question makes my head spin because it is really impossible to answer. Even if that version of me had the same genetic code, he would not be me in any meaningful sense of the word. I am in an important sense constituted by the social relationships that I have with other people and the ways in which they have shaped my experience of the world and my understanding of my own history." End quote. Is there anything that grabs your attention from this quote? We appreciate the efforts to include others online.
That makes me think of Charles Taylor's stuff with the buffered versus the porous self.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because he's basically saying like the idea of the self has become more individualistic and isolated.
Yep.
But in some sense, it's more affected by the culture around it. His example of the teenagers who like want to be independent and unique, but are really just like all their friends.
Right.
And I think the more sort of medieval example or whatever, in those cases, the self would have been well defined by the things around him, in that sort of more porous sense.
Right.
But in a more strictly constrained way.
Right. And this is where I'll frame up, just for a moment here, some of the two categories I have, objective and subjective. And I think if you talk about the medieval sense in which, our identities are shaped by the world around us, it's more objective in nature. And I think over time, we've been shifting to this more subjective sense. And again, I think sometimes this gets framed up as an either or, but I think of this as a continuum, right? That we don't eliminate the objective entirely, but this individualistic would be over here, right? This individualistic component is getting more and more emphasized. But you can't eliminate the objective, which is why, to your point and his, the middle schooler ends up looking like all their friends, because I'm more and more individualistic, but there's still rules here. There's still boundaries that I have to dive into. And so, yeah, I think that is absolutely a component. And again, I see these more as a continuum, whereas I feel like Truman, at least in his rhetoric, tends to paint things in a more dichotomous, sense that I don't think is necessarily correct.
I like the fact that he stated this, but then he said it's impossible to answer.
Right.
Because that's true. You're looking at something that didn't happen, and what if it did? And I think people do that all the time. And if that isn't your situation, why wonder and guess about it?
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, I think of like where I was born and raised and then moved to a different part of the country, and you see people who have the same beliefs, maybe the same thing, but their actions and their viewpoint is different. It's because they happen to be in that particular environment where I wasn't.
Yep.
First, I learned to adjust in some things and change my thinking, but I just like the fact that he said it's impossible to answer. You're thinking of something that can't be.
Sure. No, I think that's very good. Other thoughts? I'm going to push back a little bit. I think this is interesting. I tend, in my mind, to think of this, if we can continue with our continuum, I tend to think of the concepts of nature and nurture. And we talk about this a lot in parenting. But I find nature to be more objective. And when I say nature, I mean kind of your personality, God-given, call it the soul, whatever you will, right? And then the subjective element is the nurture, right? And that's, to your point, Shirley, the context, the people, etc., are completely different. And I don't find it hard to imagine, although I think some people fall into a trap of this being an unhelpful exercise, where they worry themselves about hypotheticals and possibilities that are never going to come to pass, could never possibly come to pass, and end up freezing themselves into inaction because they're doing all these what-ifs, right? But I find it plausible in the imaginative space to say, what if my nature, what if my soul, my personality, whatever you want to call that, were placed into a different time period, location, etc. And I find that game easy to play in my imagination, right? Of course, there's going to be a lot of nurture aspects that are going to be completely different, but I could imagine my own spirit existing in a different time and location, and it would be interesting to see how I would navigate that time and location given who I am, right? As a, soul, spirit, whatever you have. And I actually think this brings up a very important point, and I think he's kind of making a bit of an assumption here regarding our ontology, how we're built. This was a big issue in Christian circles for a long time. It's called the dichotomist versus the trichotomist distinction. Anyone want to take a stab at what they think this means, or have they heard of this before?
Referring to the nature of God or humans?
Human beings.
Okay.
Anthropology.
Yeah. I mean, the two words would mean that there's two natures or there's three natures.
Yep. So this one says human beings are fundamentally two things. We are body and soul. Okay. This one says human beings are fundamentally three things. We are body, soul, and spirit. Right? And of course, again, this has been a debate in Christian circles for a long time. What do these people do with spirit? They just say soul and spirit are kind of interchangeable. They say it's essentially referring to the same thing, right? So this is a dichotomous position, trichotomous position. If you get real nitty-gritty in seminary, they might ask what your position is in regard to human nature and the soul, okay? There's actually a third position that's very rare. I learned about this from Michael Green. And he calls it's essentially a monist position. He says these are like distinct made-up categories that aren't real and biblical. Michael Green says we are ensouled bodies or embodied souls. He said you can't separate that. You can't change that or split it or anything like that. You're an ensouled body or an embodied soul. And the reason I bring this up is I don't think would necessarily even agree with Michael Green at this point, but I feel like Truman is kind of making a monistic assumption regarding the nature of the human body or soul, right? The way we are. Because if you understand even just a dichotomous position, let's say you weren't a full trichotomist, and if you're interested, I loosely adhere to this. This is definitely a tertiary or quaternary issue, right? So
can you
go
just
ahead.
really briefly explain the difference between soul and spirit as a trichotomist would say they're different?
Yeah. A trichotomist, I think, would say that a dog has a soul, but not necessarily a spirit, if that makes sense, right?
It's almost like the non-physical elements that make them who they are, their habits, their personality.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that soul, you could almost tie the soul with your habits, your
Thoughts even.
Yeah, exactly.
Soul.
Yeah, because those things can be more automatic in a sense as well, right?
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that because my daughter, when she was in nursing school, and this is very rare, they told her when you're treating a patient, remember, there's more than just a body there. They said there's a body, a soul, and a spirit. That's what you're treating, not just an illness. And sometimes it was more important to be concerned about their soul or their spirit rather than their sickness because that was a way of comforting. And
Yeah.
you don't hear that anymore. But that was the training that she got as a nurse.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And so my point is simply that, again, Truman says, this question makes my head spin. I would not be me in any meaningful sense. And I'm like, well, then you have got to be taking this position because I feel like you could eliminate this body and move my soul and put it in a different body, and I would still be me in a meaningful sense. Different, but me, right? So anyway, it's hypothetical.
When you mentioned the genetic code, I got to thinking, I don't maybe I'm off, because when I think of genetics, it's like in a family, your genetics are similar, the same. And yet you take family members that move to different places or whatever and spend their time growing up there, even though genetically they're linked, they can be totally different.
Right.
So in that sense, your social and things around you has nothing to do with genetics.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, I just thought this was interesting, and I just wanted to stop here real quick because to me, these dichotomies, these bifurcations, whatever you want, I don't mean it in that sense, but like this either or, to me, is the whole chapter. He keeps doing this, and I see things on much more of a continuum, right? And so anyway, I just want to bring that up. Any further questions on this before we keep going?
I'm curious where you get the monist impression in the chapter. Is it just kind of throughout, or is there a specific?
No.
section?
It's not. It's not him. That's Michael Green's stance. But when he says, when he says essentially, again, what if I had been born in France in 1770 to a family of French nobles rather than in England in the 1960s to a family of the lower middle class? When he says, that makes my head spin, it's really impossible to answer. Even if that version of me had the same genetic code, he would not be me in any meaningful sense of the word. I just disagree. Yeah, that's essentially what he's saying, and I feel like there's almost a monistic assumption underneath that. Because I think you could take my soul or spirit or both or whatever out and put it in, the 1770s France, and I would be me in a different body with a different nurture, but with quite a similar nature, if that makes sense.
But he's saying like almost that the habits of life and thought are as much part of you as your DNA.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. And I'm not sure I agree.
I wonder too, this sort of just makes me think of the practice of compartmentalization.
Right.
And I think when I hear you say he can't really conceive of a disembodied soul, like they
Right.
have to sort of constantly be reciprocating into each other, I wonder if the current culture is so good at compartmentalization that it's led to fragmentation.
Mm.
And that's part of the challenge. And I think that conservatives, it's funny, I think there's a weird spectrum going on because I think in church, though, we reduce the faith to Christian rationalism like we did in our prior study, which
Right.
is a kind of compartmentalization, in my opinion. But I don't know, I feel like it's a really interesting thing to consider because I don't think that compartmentalization is necessarily a bad thing. Like, it can be helpful to ponder the distinctions.
Yeah.
But I also think that you can push it to a point where you dehumanize yourself and de-image yourself, if that makes sense.
Right.
And so I don't really know how to wield it well without like trying to do it like very thoughtfully with tons of nuance. Because I don't think that, I don't know, it doesn't seem like it's going well in the greater culture.
Sure.
But
Yeah, and I'm generally in agreement with what you said. I think the nuance is captured in the continuum itself, right? Which of course can also go wrong, but I don't think either-oring things is helpful. It actually is. Either-oring things is helpful as a thought exercise to frame up the extremes, but to me it doesn't capture the vast swath of gray or nuance in the middle. So, and just as an aside, I find Michael Green's modus position to be very intriguing. I find him fascinating on this topic. But there are simple things in the Bible that, to me, lend themselves to a dichotomous or a trichotomous position more readily. Like, where was Jesus when he was dead in the grave 3 days, right? I presume his spirit, his soul, was out doing a bunch of stuff, right? Perhaps in hell, I don't know, right? But if he's an ensouled body or embodied soul such that it's inseparable, like what happened during those 3 days, So I kind of wonder about things like that. And then when I, think about heaven and different things like that, I just think the Christian position lends itself to these categories more readily. Even personal experience, such as Romans chapter 7, when Paul is describing things like, the things I desire to do, I do not do. I'm caught between two things. I agree with the law that it's good, but I find in my members it difficult to work that out. To me, he's expressing kind of a fundamental, perhaps, fragmentation that is involved in being human, right? And so I just tend to think these positions are more likely. But, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the medieval scholastics would say it has to be three.
Right.
Because there's the principle of the triad.
Yes, correct.
I like to have threes. I actually I need to comment on like this continuum. It's funny because when I lived in Germany for a bit, and the politics there are very left. So their conservative people are still more left than our left people.
Oh, I got you.
So this continuum, I think, is sort of squashed toward the objective nature.
Yep.
By what he's talking about next, which is like this desire to belong,
Yes.
and how that he talks about it shaping the teenagers, and you're being all independent, but you're not like choosing to dress like a frog.
Right.
You're choosing to dress like your peers.
Yep.
Even though you're exercising your independence, you're really conforming.
Correct.
And so like if you were to like say this continuum, the subjective element of you, and he's going to talk about kind of you being able to kind of choose your nature and the sort of plastic liquid world plastic selves.
Yep.
You could I mean, and maybe eventually people will go here, but you could decide that your identity is a tree or a frog or whatever.
Right.
But the desire to belong and to be a part of a group prevents us from sort of taking that far.
Right.
We want to be something that can be in relationship.
Yep.
And so our identities don't go to a place where that becomes not possible, right?
Right.
And so that belonging element really kind of constrains this continuum toward the objective side.
Right. I think what you're getting at too, to me, is yet another aspect of the continuum, and it's group identity markers versus individual identity markers, right? And so I think we could put group identity markers here and individual identity markers here. And the point being, again, that it's a continuum, and I don't think you eliminate any side of the thing. So to your point, what does he bring up? He brings up the individualism, right, aspect, and he says, oh, you're super individualistic, and yet you dress like all your peers. But I think we see the same thing in other progressive leftist expressions as well. To me, you can't get rid of the objective. It's just a matter of where you put it. It's a matter of emphasis on objective versus subjective and where you put it, right? So certain forms of leftism, we're going to really emphasize individual identity, and then it's all about your group identity markers. What's your race? What's your gender? What's your this? What's your that? Etc. Right? And it's like you didn't eliminate the objective. You just put it in its certain compartment. You see what I mean? And I think that's kind of characteristic of what we see with so many of these movements is there's a matter of emphasis on where you're at on the continuum, but you never completely eliminate the objective, and you never completely eliminate the subjective either. It's just where do you put it, right?
Well, and oftentimes it's about which values your group markers are
Right.
promoting.
Yes, exactly.
Right. That's what I was going to kind of bring up with this idea is that I think he talked about it too, where it's like, and I think I'll go into it more of that LGBTQ community. It's like you have this individual idea getting away from your parents, your church, your nation, whatever, all those things. It's like you're throwing out those groups
Right. So you
in
think
favor of your LGBTQ group.
Right.
You're still choosing a different group. You're just, now I can make my own choice. I'm
Right.
not living like we talked about in a previous study of like,
Yeah.
this is just where you grew up and who's around you. You have to fit in.
correct.
Now it's like you can connect with anyone you want to across the world, and that you're making that choice, but you're still choosing a group.
Right.
You're not being individual, really.
And to me, that's, I've brought up many times in the study things like faux individualism or like, and that's what I think what a lot of people who are doing those sorts of things don't realize. They think they're doing this, right? They think they're doing that, but in terms of objective, subjective emphasis, they remain in the same spot. They just exchanged their objective piece for a different set of objective pieces. But it's like you haven't actually got any more, focused on this subjective element and really discovering who you are. You just swapped one for the other, right? This is where I often say, I said this online in a video one time, and somebody really came after me, but I said, I've met atheist fundamentalists, right? And they were like, what do you mean atheist fundamentalists? And it's like the spirit of fundamentalism can exist in any belief system, structure, etc. You don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to be a Muslim. You could be an atheist and still be a fundamentalist, right? There's a certain spirit that it occupies in terms of a continuum like this. You're here, right? And the only question is, what are the fundamentals that we're adhering to? But at the end of the day, you are choosing a particular set of fundamentals, and you're saying, this is the hill we die on. And oftentimes in debates, you will see a Christian fundamentalist arguing with an atheist fundamentalist, right? And it gets real fiery, right? But at the end of the day, nobody's making any progress with each other because they're just fundamentalists at the end of the day. But again, I've had atheists come after me because they're like, that doesn't make sense. It's a contradiction in terms. It's like, no, you misunderstand the categories, right?
Well, you're using it more as like a personal style or a pejorative term instead of like just being applied to a particular group.
Correct. I mean it in a stages of faith sense that Fowler talks about. Fowler talks about stages of faith, and he gives 6 stages 1 to 6. And to me, fundamentalism is essentially somebody stuck in stage 3, refusing to move into stage 4, according to Fowler, right? And so you can be in stage 3 with any set of like fundamental convictions. The real characteristic element is that you're in stage 3, right? But that's a different study. Anyway, so again, I think these continue. Let me go. It's still in this category, and I want to bring this up because I think it's important. He goes down on 113 and then on to 114. And he starts kind of describing these back and forth. Is my identity, therefore, not in large part a matter of my own free choice? In a sense, yes, it is. Human beings are intentional creatures. We shape our own destinies, unlike other creatures. Beavers build dams because they are instinctively disposed to do so. Cats catch mice because that is what cats do. With our previous discussion, this is the soul, right, if you're a trichotomist. Neither beavers nor cats reflect upon these actions, nor do they decide to do them in the sense that I might decide to paint a picture, build a wall, or go fishing. Again, in a trichotomist sense, that would be spirit, right? That's a spiritual independent choice that someone is making. As a human being, I can act intentionally. And then moving on to 114, we do not make these intentional decisions in a vacuum. Rather, we make them in the context of the societies in which we inhabit and their wider histories in which we are placed, societies whose framework provides the means by which our actions have meaning. End quote. Again, I think he's right, but it's a matter of emphasis. He's talking about nature or nurture, right? This is the society and the structure in which this sort of thing comes up. But, and so he's really emphasizing, it's not done in a vacuum. But what he's trying to emphasize, I think, is, again, it's just a matter of emphasis. It's a matter of continuum, whereas like he's, to me, trying to argue for an either-or, a yes-no, when it comes to this topic, and he's just trying to say, well, you're not as objectively, expressive individual just in your spirit as you think. And I say, yes, but it's a matter of emphasis, right? That's kind of where I come from on this. I want to use this time to talk about the Overton window. I talked about it before, but I want to go a little bit more in depth into this. Does anyone know what the Overton window is? You might be remembering from, I don't think we talked about it last time, but we talked about it like 2 or 3 times ago. I talked about the Overton window. Yes. Cool. Well, I'm glad I'm bringing it up again. The Overton window is essentially what I'll call the range of acceptable discourse in a society or in a culture, okay? And the reason I'm bringing this up is that's exactly what he's talking about here, right? He's talking about, the decisions you make, the things you do, how you choose to live. These aren't made in a vacuum. You're making them in a societal context. And we make these decisions in a societal context that is governed by the Overton window. The Overton window was coined, the idea behind it, by a man named Joseph Overton. And he was 1960 to 2003. And again, it's the range of acceptable discourse. What people deem to be legitimate or illegitimate opinions in the realm of public discourse. This is related to what you just said about Germany and kind of, because their Overton window is different than ours. And let me describe it here in a sec. So we'll use our continuum again, okay? And I'm going to use a simple example, but hopefully it makes sense of the Overton window itself. Now, in the middle of the Overton window, this is essentially policy, okay? This is the stuff like we enshrine into law because everyone agrees like this is dead center, Overton window. That's what we want it to be. Now, on either side of policy, you might have opinions that we would call popular, okay? And so you can have popular opinions in one direction, or you can have popular opinions in another direction, okay? Now, one step outside of that, you have opinions that people might deem to be sensible, okay? So you have sensible opinions here, sensible opinions here. And then again, we will use an example to try and illustrate. Beyond that, you have acceptable opinions, okay? We are getting further and further away from the Overton window, the center of it. And so these opinions are getting continually questionable in terms of socially what is appropriate for people to say or believe. Then, beyond the acceptable, now you're getting to radical opinions on either side. And finally, at the far ends, the unthinkable. Okay? How could anybody ever do, say, believe, think that? The unthinkable. All right? Now I'll bring up a topic to try and illustrate the Overton window with which all of us have some familiarity. Bedtime for children. Bedtime for children. Okay? Now, if you were thinking about bedtime for children, the unthinkable, well, let's not start at the unthinkable. Let's start in the middle, okay? What's policy? Dead center of the Overton window. Something like, and again, people could go plus or minus on this, something like 8 p.m. bedtime, but plus or minus with some exceptions here or there, right? I think most people, roughly in that ballpark, would say that's kind of, dead center of the Overton window. Nobody could take really exception to that. Now, what would you do on either side of that, right? Well, on this side, you might say 7 p.m. bedtime. And I think a lot of people would say, okay, that's a little early, but that opinion could be popular with some. On the other side, you might say, look, we don't have like a set bedtime every night of the week, but we have like a weekend, weekday setup, right? And so weekends, we have slightly different bedtimes than weekdays. It kind of matches the rhythm of mom and dad. And so you can see this one's a little bit more loose and lax. This one's a little bit more strict. But again, these might be relatively popular opinions. Now, continuing down, somebody sensible, right? 6 p.m., right? Holy smoke, 6 p.m., that's, you're getting a little bit,
Parents better go to bed at 8.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly right. Now, going this way, a little bit more loose, maybe kids go to bedtime same time as adults, right? So, hey, when mom and dad go to bed, that's when you go to bed. You don't have a specific bedtime, etc., right? And you can continue out further and further. 5 p.m., right? Now we might not be acceptable. Maybe we skipped acceptable entirely. This is radical, okay? This is radical, 5 p.m. bedtime. 4 p.m. bedtime, unthinkable. What are you doing, right? Absolutely unthinkable. Whereas over here, right, maybe on the radical side, children decide, right? It's up to them. They get to pick when they go to bed. They don't have a bedtime. The children just decide. Or the unthinkable, no bedtime. Do whatever you want, right? No bedtime whatsoever. So you see it's a silly example, but that's how the Overton window works, okay? And, it's called a window because typically something like this is how it functions in society. And when you feel like your opinion is over here or over here, and you're in like polite company, you probably don't share your opinion, right? You kind of keep your mouth shut and you don't say anything because you're like, look, I'm at the 4 p.m. bedtime club, but I can tell that's not welcome around here, right? And so you don't say anything about it because that's not where the Overton window is. And of course, the Overton window shifts over time. Just in the last 50 years, there are certain policy concepts and ideas that are now perfectly acceptable in the realm of social discourse that were absolutely unthinkable before. It's been a conservative talking point for several years now that you can grab clips from Hillary Clinton or Obama, et cetera, saying homosexuality is, not acceptable for marriage, et cetera. Oh, how quickly we've shifted the Overton window on that topic, right? So, anyway, go ahead.
Oh, I was just thinking of other examples, too, of the radical bedtime stuff. We have had friends that their schedule is basically centered around their child's sleep.
Ah,
And I was thinking not just like the timing, but also like the strictness that you follow it,
yeah, sure.
right? So you have like families that are like, well, we have 1 p.m. nap, so we just can't go anywhere at noon.
Right. There you
We go
go.
to the park at 11, but we can't leave after 12:30 because naps
There you
are
go.
at 1 o'clock, and we
Yeah.
have to be there.
Naps are absolutely
Right,
essential, right? So
exactly.
the rigidity with which it
Yeah.
is held.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. That can make a big difference too.
My kids were little. It was policy. It didn't change until they got to high school. They had a bedtime. It didn't matter how dark or how light it was outside, how many kids are still playing. You didn't necessarily go to sleep, but you went to your bedroom and you went to bed. It
Understood.
never changed, ever, until they got to high school and was in sports, and then we didn't have a choice.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So I don't know, maybe we were kind of, I don't know, but that,
I think it's fine.
it was just sad. Our
Yeah.
kids didn't even question it. They just knew at that time you went to the bedroom.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. And look, structure can be very good for children. I mean, there's no, you won't see me pushing back. Right?
Most of this seems to like morph through time as culture kind of accepts new normals.
That's exactly right.
And it, to me, like I was thinking when you first brought this up, I was like, I found it on Wikipedia, and I was like, oh, the first time I saw the unthinkable was like, I was thinking like, oh, arranged marriage.
Yes,
'Cause
correct.
like 200 years ago, that was perfectly acceptable.
Yes, if you had this
And
and,
now
you did
it's
it
like
for
unthinkable.
yes, if you had this same thing and you had arranged marriage on the one side and I can pick
Totally
my
permissible.
spouse at age 5 on the other side, whatever, right? Like, and that's the range. We have moved more and more this direction over time, away from sort of an arranged marriage. And yeah, that used to be, over here was the Overton window, and it's done that, right? And
Well,
to
and I
me,
think
that's
it's
the
also
shift
a-
towards the subjective.
Exactly.
It's the
and
same
shift
shift.
away from like the group mentality kind
Correct.
of dictating how things operate. Because
Yeah.
it used to be the families would sort of like pick
You nailed it.
spouses.
Yes.
And now it's you do it yourself. And now it's like there's not even commitment doesn't even need to be involved.
Right.
You can just flip around.
Yes, exactly right. Yep.
How do you think this correlates, I guess, with what he was talking about on page 125 and 124 and 125? Kind of where he's talking about how we've lost the sense of unity as a nation, essentially, and how civil society was possible because there was differences, there was this deeper narrative. Even though there was differences, there's this deeper narrative that caused unity. And now, like, you can see in the last few elections, there's no longer the case of like, oh, well, that other party won, I guess that other party won, whatever.
Yep.
Like, I feel like the Overton window in like our nation
Yes.
it's like divided, where it's like there's 2 Overton windows now.
Yes. There's a different model that's so helpful. This is really insightful. Let me share with
It doesn't match anymore.
Well, you will. You'll just go, oh, okay. So it's a perfect illustration. And there are 2 ways of thinking about the Overton window. One is what I just described. And I think you're correct. The Overton window is shifting in a different way. One way to think about the range of acceptable discourse is not in a straight line, but instead like this. And the Overton window exists like this. And slides up and down. Here's where it's at. Think of all the opinions we just described, but they are situated around. If the Overton window is slid up, and it's like here,
More moderate perspectives.
moderate perspectives are reigning supreme. Radicalism on either side of the aisle is unacceptable, right? Nobody's really cool with the radicalism on either side. I think what you observed is correct. I think the Overton window has shifted down this way. Now, moderate perspectives are rare as hen's teeth, and it's a radicalism on either side that's the Overton window. The range of acceptable discourse is either this super extreme position
Right.
or
It's
this super
acceptable,
extreme
right.
position. But to say, hey, both sides have a good point is completely unacceptable at the moment. The Overton window is nowhere near any of the moderate positions. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the Overton, some have made the case the Overton window does not slide linearly like that, but instead it slides up and down between radicalism and moderation, right? And so I think it's a helpful way of looking at it. If that's correct, then we are way down here right now. something like this.
So in your bedtime example, it's either okay to have kids have no bedtime,
Correct.
or it's okay for them.
And
to go
is
to bed
that
at
not
4
what we
p.m.?
see? Is that not
Yeah,
what we see? I
it
mean,
really
you
is.
pick up a parenting book nowadays, and it's either like radical,
Child-centered,
yes,
child-led,
exactly.
Everything is about
mega gentle everything, like the child sets the rules for everyone, or the other side, like that's what's wrong with society today. We need to be rigid and strict, etc. And it seems like somebody's saying, well, there's a realm of gentle, and it seems like those positions aren't being expressed, right? So if you take our day and age, our current Overton window probably looks something like this, right? Where it's like the only.
Sometimes I feel like as Christians we are like not in the Overton window at all because we're not radical enough on
Sure.
either side of it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as Christians.
Depending on
No, I know exactly what you mean. I think we could and ought to be a moderating force if we could separate ourselves from the, what are they called? The silos that people kind of have for themselves, right? And that we could kind of be that force that does that. I do think, unfortunately, against our better judgment, Christians often fall into the same kinds of social traps as other people, radically identifying either with more liberal or more conservative values and getting very, very extreme, right? So, yeah, go ahead.
On that point, I actually feel a little bit like the people who are on this side, we'll call it the like extreme non-Christian viewpoint, in a something like child rearing or maybe marriage, masculinity, femininity.
Right.
They actually sometimes, I feel like their weapon of choice is to say that the Christian view is the crazy 2 p.m. bedtime one.
Right.
And then it's like a good Christian, like when we have a discourse that it's 2 hours long and then they are able to explain what the viewpoint actually is.
Yes.
It comes out to be true or where it is, and it's not that crazy 2 p.m. I think we got to have the kids spanked every 5 seconds on the
Right.
dot. But there is this like tiny subsect of Christians who like double down on that too.
Yes, you're correct.
And so it's kind of like that small subset is like, well, I'm glad you're brave, but you're actually like maybe off base here.
Sure.
But then no one is listening to the reasonable Christians, and they don't get the YouTube algorithms on their side. Yeah, and so it's like it's so frustrating because I feel like if you want to be good, you're just always misunderstood. And
Sure.
there's not really this environment where you're actually your viewpoint is given an honest look.
Sure.
And that's just incredibly rare. But I will say on that point, just a minor piece of hope that in the last month or two, I have seen really popular people on the internet like Bill Maher or Stephen A. Smith, and they've had like these conversations with people on the polar opposite side that have been very civil. And it's shocking. It's like he sat down with Ben Shapiro and it's like talking about race, a black guy and a white guy. I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think this was possible. It's like maybe this is like where society can make a turn almost and try to understand the other viewpoint and end up in a moderation that's also principled. Because I think that's the scary part to me anyway, is like, oh, Christians got to be this moderating force. It's like we actually just have to be the truth, and then and then like express that right and have conversations that enable the other side to like see it honestly. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of valuable to that. And for what it's worth, I'm self-serving for a moment. My epistemological program that I'm trying to do is similar to that. So here's what I think is happening, right? Bear with me for a moment. I think we have on maybe the one side what I'll call Christian foundationalism. I'm learning more categories as I study, guys, so just be patient with me. I'll call it Christian foundationalism, and then over here, we'll have, let's just call it relativism, right? And here's my point, and where people don't get it, is I think people who have run to the relativism side are like, oh yeah, I object to Christianity. And I'm like, no. You're objecting to foundationalism. You're not objecting to Christianity, you're objecting to foundationalism. You can keep the Christianity without the foundationalism, right? And that's what I feel like we're trying to do with, the epistemological paradigm that I've been trying to share with everyone is I think people oscillate between one or the other extreme position, and they don't recognize that, yes, there are components of this that you are rejecting, but it's actually not, it's not Christianity itself that you're objecting to. You're objecting to a philosophical, cultural expression of Christianity that you don't like, but you don't have to leave Christianity, right? Like, and so that's what I feel like I'm doing with my epistemological program is I'm trying to separate the Christianity from the foundationalism and say, I agree, foundationalism has some problems. That doesn't mean we get rid of Jesus, right? Like, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
I mean, this is like the deconstruction stuff.
Correct.
Right? People are
Yes.
wanting to move to relativism when they should just move kind of to the moderate side.
Right. But
Yeah.
the problem is they don't have an imagination that can allow them to say, no, maybe there are components here that need to be, that we need, yeah, exactly. And instead, it's just like, okay, these are my two choices. And I know I don't like this, so here I go over here.
And I feel like, too, like with the internet and sort of everybody's a movie star kind of mentality, everyone's pursuing some kind of like 5 seconds of fame.
Yes.
Extremism and controversy gets you noticed.
You're 100%
So being
correct.
moderate does not help you
You nailed it.
at all.
You nailed it. You are guaranteed some clicks and
Yeah.
likes and views if you express one of these positions. Much less if you express any of these positions, right? But I do think you're right, Ryan. There's a sense in which this, I think we got that window about as extreme as we can, and I think some of the radical tendencies are starting to wane a little bit, and I think over time we might see this window shift further and further back towards the more centrist or moderate position.
Well, and on that point, I think it's interesting the tactic I've seen a few people take, sort of the sin of empathy approach, where it's like, I'm going to actually try to be that clickbait guy, but what I'm saying isn't in truth crazy radical, but I know I'm going to catch a few people who think I'm a nut job and are tuning in just for that, and that's
Right.
my entry point to explain like something that is actually in reality existing in just the Christian part. But it's like that's almost what Christians have to do now, is be like spicy, but know that the core of their content is going to be something that's actually biblical, you
Sure.
know, to catch that. Because, yeah, we're living, going back to the chapter, it's like this area where the internet, narratives, the acceptance, all that is sort of like, those are the controlling forces. So how do we play the game?
Yeah, I think on the other side of the coin, you could say that's a bit of a bait and switch tactic, and it might be best to just stay the course and kind of hope and pray, you know what I mean? And again, I could understand arguments in either direction. I really could. I think I would tend towards, it's been seen down through history. There are many people who had radical thoughts relative to their time period, and right now the radical is the centrist, and they just put their ideas out there, and then they were discovered hundreds of years later as being way before their time. Soren Kierkegaard comes to mind. He was not really popular at all in his day and age. He was way ahead of his time, and now his writings are being rediscovered, and he was absolute
He's the
genius.
quintessential existentialist Christian, right?
Right, exactly.
Which is kind of where our culture's at.
Right,
So
and
like,
pe-
well, there's
and people-
something you can't know. And
Yes.
So, like, how do you get past that?
And when he was writing, nobody could make sense of that even category at all, right? A Christian existentialist, what are you even talking about, right? Whereas now people are like, oh boy, he's got a lot of good stuff to say. So anyway, you had your hand up for a while.
Some of it already got said, so stop me if it's redundant. But I was just thinking that I wonder if the way that we shift the Overton window these days also is motivated not only by like the influencer culture where everybody feels like they have to have a platform that's fairly charged, like everyone was saying, but also just the meaning crisis where so many of our stances now across all the taboo subjects have been sort of weaponized for virtue signaling. So how you feel about finances in the economic systems is a virtue signaling platform now. Sex and sexual orientation is weaponized as well. I think every single one of those taboo things, religion, you name it. And it's funny because I think the moderate space, the Christian space, is like, ideally we could be free from that because we find our meaning and mission outside of the virtue signaling construct. But obviously that's not like totally how it's done. But I was just thinking, like, I wonder if that might be part of the pattern too. Is like when you, why are those the things that move the Overton window now? And I think it's just because that's everyone's trying to find meaning in a new way, and we're doing it very charged, I guess. So the virtue signaling thing was kind of what I was thinking of. But
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I think that's really helpful. And I think our goal as Christians would be to figure out how to, and this is similar to, what Ryan, you were saying a minute ago, but you kind of need to be able to speak into the frame of mind where people are at the moment in the time, and yet show that we're not playing the same game, if that makes sense, right? Like, you need to be able to say, like, I understand your concerns on this particular issue or problem. Like, the idea I'm getting is something, you almost need to be like a planeswalker or something, right? Like, you can walk into their situation, see what's going on, identify it, but be like, hey, you guys are stuck in the shadow realm over here. We need to move to a different space.
There's an artist that I love, Makoto Fujimara, who talks about artists as border walkers.
Yes,
and that
yes.
art is supposed to be one of the like connective means where you can step into other people's spaces, but like walk the borders of
Yes.
the tribalism and actually, understand how to properly use empathy to like draw people in
Yep.
different directions and invite them into new spaces of understanding. But that border walker mindset, I think, is key.
That's exactly it. Yep.
Well, and I think what you're saying goes back to when people create these reductionist models of people or things or culture or whatever. Like we're in the middle in reality, but people tend to want to put you in a box on one side or the other. And
Right.
it's useful to understand what people are doing with that box, but also to kind of like deconstruct it, be like, this is not a real category. This is just a straw man.
Yep.
And I think to understand like people's wrong models of the way they would see the world and other people, and be able to like use art or other things to kind of take those apart.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I'm going to frame up another comparison here. Who has heard of behaviorism? Anybody? Okay. In the realm of sociology and psychology, behaviorism came about right around the time that Darwin's theories of, evolution were really taking hold, right? And behaviorism was a very extreme form of, I'll call it fatalism almost. Here's the idea. The behaviorists essentially said this: hey, here's what we have going on as human beings. We are merely a function of our cells and our brain synapses firing, etc., in response to various stimuli that are out there in the world imposing themselves upon me, etc. And the behaviorists would say, if we knew every single input into you as a human being, so all of your predilections, all of your experiences, then we could predict with 100% certainty what action you would take in any given scenario. That's the behaviorist perspective, okay? So it takes this kind of Darwinian evolutionary idea and says, man, if we were just at a supercomputer that could crunch all the data, we would know exactly how you would act in every single given situation, period, bar none. Go ahead.
It's basically what an atheist should be.
Correct. That's
or should
exactly
believe,
right. Yes.
Because it's consistent with we're just
Correct.
cells fizzing.
And that's a common apologetic argument against atheism is
If you're not actually a
correct.
behaviorist, then
You don't act like a behaviorist even though your stated philosophical system ought to lead you to that, right? Go ahead.
I was just saying, so behavioral psychology, it's the black box idea, right? So you just have inputs and outputs, and all you can observe is inputs and outputs.
Right.
And you're basically pretending like the only way that you can understand the thing is the inputs and outputs.
Right.
And I think it's really interesting. There's a lot of stuff in the AI space right now where people are thinking maybe these machines could become intelligent.
Right.
But really they can't, because the computer model of which is based on the neurological synapses and all that stuff.
Yep.
Internally is just this.
Correct.
It's just a bunch of inputs, learn how to map to some outputs.
Yep.
And so it's just imitating the reality of life. It's not,
Yes.
not trying to, it can't actually like be the thing itself.
Yep.
That reminded me of the book Blink by, I think it might be Malcolm Gladwell, but I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, and there's a really cool example in that book where he talks about when they were trying to get the technology to that point of
Yep.
just algorithmically predicting decisions in warfare. And they actually had a supercomputer create a war scenario, and they actually had several military generals making decisions, and they were basically trying to argue for the technology might be good enough that we can replace the decision making, remove the human component and just lean on this, and it didn't work.
Yep.
And they could not make sense of it, and at the end of the day they were like, there's something about gut intuitive human decision making
Yep.
that feels inspired, that threw the computer for a loop, and was able to beat the computer every time. And it was or at least long game, and so it was interesting because, obviously behaviorism and black box mentality cannot account for the strange intuition that seems so particularly human.
Yep, that's exactly right. And that's why I wanted to bring this up, because again, to me, this falls on our spectrum here, right? You have one way of viewing the world, which is it's just black box there, and then you have another way of viewing the world, which there's a subjective component, there's an intuition component, and again, your poetry, your metaphors, all that type of stuff lives in this realm, right? And so the reason I want to bring it up, because yet again, we find ourselves on a continuum, as we talk about these ideas, because, the reason I bring this up is he was explicitly saying, again, isn't my identity a large part a matter of my own free choice? We make intentional decisions, all this type of stuff, right? And again, to me, it's a matter of emphasis, on whether or not I'm being more affected by the objective things that I can't control, like around me, or am I being affected by that subjective element, that true intuition, the soul, the spirit, that is in many ways not quantifiable, And so I think that's relevant as well.
The computer isn't human, and it doesn't think besides what was put in there. If it
Yes.
isn't there, it can't do anything with it.
Yep.
And I
So-
get frustrated with it.
Well, I'll share. This was an absolutely essential book for me to read on my discovery of epistemology and why I'm doing what I'm doing. I read a book on a whim called The Myth of AI. And we hear about AI all the time nowadays. AI is what everyone is talking about, right? And in the book, The Myth of AI, the author essentially tries to take the stance that true AI, to what you were saying earlier, true artificial intelligence is impossible. It's not possible. And so call it whatever you want. You can call it AI if you want, but really it's an algorithm, a very advanced algorithm with a lot of computing power that can go scrape the entire internet of lots and lots of information and then aggregate it and try to put it into categories. But at the end of the day, it's not intelligent, right? It's not, and the author says this, the reason AI, he basically takes a stance, he says AI is impossible and will never be possible in the truest sense of the word. And he says why? He says there is an element of human reasoning called abductive inference that computers are completely unable to do. It's an entirely human activity to do abductive inference, and computers will never be able to do that. And this is, when I discovered abductive inference, that struck me as a very important discovery, because it's like, okay, if this is uniquely human, only humans can do this thing, maybe that is an important element to our epistemology. And that's when I started to dig into it and discover it, and I've talked about many of the ideas as well. But to that point, I would agree with you wholeheartedly, right? Because this is, abductive inference is the process whereby you come up with hypotheses, okay? So I've talked about it before, but you have deduction, which is top-down reasoning, and then you have induction, which is bottom-up reasoning. Bottom-up reasoning is usually how we conduct experiments to try and prove certain things, right? So, I drop a marker and I go, that fell at a certain speed. Oh, if I do it again, it seems to fall at the same speed. Let's measure the speed, etc. But the act of going from individual particular observations to a hypothesis, gravity is a force which exerts itself on dropped objects at 9.81 meters per second squared. That hypothesis, coming up with that hypothesis, is an abductive inference. hypothesizing from particular observations to a general rule about the world around us is abductive inference. And it's a uniquely human act, right? Because we have to very quickly sort negligible data that doesn't matter from really important data that matters as well. I don't know if you've seen it, but there are already, our AI is really good. There are silly mistakes that AI makes that a human would never make because they're unable to do abductive inference, right? And you're just like, how on earth could you come to that conclusion, AI? But then you begin to see, oh, I see where it went wrong. It took this information and made that primary in its analysis, when really that's like, it's not even tertiary. That shouldn't even enter the equation, but it focused its attention. If you ever use AI to summarize an article, and then you read the article, it will miss very key important points because it doesn't know what's super important versus what's not, right? It can't tell. All of that is abductive. When you read, you quickly in your mind can sort from the ancillary information that is not important at all, to the really key ideas that are essential to what the author is pointing out. The AI can't do that, right? Why? Because it's an abductive act of knowledge. So.
AR, the stupid computer, keeps saying, you can't ask that question, do that. It's like, but this is my question. This is what I need an answer to. And I finally said, either give me a person or I'll hang up. Eventually, I got a person.
There you go. That's right, Shirley. I appreciate that. There you go. That's right. All right, where are we at? Are we about time? Yeah, so we can kind of get to wrapping up here. We talked about personhood, and then we talked extensively about the Overton window and individual versus group identity. And this is characteristic of different cultures as well, okay? So if you go to certain cultures, many Eastern cultures, or like Latin American cultures, etc., they have more of a group component to their sense of identity. So, like any cultures where there's a large emphasis on honor, for example, those often have more of a group identity. Stop acting so individualistic. You need to do what is honorable to the family, right? And whereas when you go on Western cultures and societies, that's not the case at all, right? And again, we talked about extreme forms of the individualism where we just completely cut off our families, right? Never talking to you again because, you wouldn't affirm my identity in some way, shape, or form. So I'm never going to speak to you again. And so really this shift towards the subjective, this expressive individual move, Western society is leading the way, right? Is absolutely leading the way. And so that's why we have to adapt. And we haven't seen this before, right? And we're trying to figure out, okay, what aspects of this are good? What are problematic? What can we do in light of this impulse or this spiritual shift that we seem to see all around us in society today? One other aspect where I think this is helpful is if we go to the Imagined Communities section, okay? Under Imagined Communities, page 117, I think there's another element of this, right? And this is globalism versus nationalism, okay? He says, nations almost by definition involve so vast an area of geographical space, such large populations, and so many individual communities, villages, towns, cities, that it is impossible for everyone to know everyone else. This means that for a nation to exist, its members must imagine that they hold things in common that give them a coherent identity as a body of people. And again, I'm just going to keep putting this on our spectrum. By the way, this is this spectrum, what did I call it before? I had a great word for it. A line. Come on, I said something else. A continuum. This continuum, thank you. You guys are great. This is a big problem, historically speaking, in philosophy, right? And they call it the difference between the one and the many. If you go all the way back to Plato, right? No, because the one and the many, these are all the individual particulars. Oh, I see. The unified idea versus... Correct. That's exactly right. So if you go back to Plato, Plato would often talk about the realm of forms. He's talking about this, right? He'd talk about a chair, right? Like what makes a chair a chair? And if you actually sit and think about it, like it's hard to define, right? Like if you were to say, well, a four-legged object that's meant for sitting on. It's like, well, there's a chair that has 3 legs. That works just fine. And so you start trying to define a chair and what makes a chair, it gets really, really difficult. And so Plato said there's this idea of chairness, right, out there, and that's the overarching theme, the concept, the realm of forms. And every particular instantiation of chair in the world shares with the chairness of the universe, right? Contrast that with many, the particulars, right? Atomism was a common, these are ancient ideas. Atomism was, I don't know if it was Democritus or who it was, but atomism was this idea that no, there's no forms. It's just all little particular individual things, right? And back and forth you go, right? But here's why I bring this up in this context. The same problem persists. We keep oscillating between the one and the many. We can't seem to hold both in tension and say both of these things exist. And where is this the case? It's globalism versus nationalism. Right? Globalism versus nationalism. Globalism emphasizes the oneness of all of humanity, and we all share in this common, humanity, etc. Nationalism emphasizes our differences, our uniqueness, right? We have tariffs. There you go. That's a perfect example. That's our current administration is swinging us strongly back towards nationalism, right? They're swinging us strongly back towards nationalism away from globalist tendencies, right? So this America First mindset, make America great again, all that type of stuff has very strong nationalistic tendencies. It's actually very individualistic in a sense, right? Those particulars matter. Like rather than saying we're just all one and we should all be the same and all that type of stuff, instead we know that we have differences. We're unique as a nation. We have particular values and different ideas, and we want to stick to those first and foremost. If we can help others, then fine. But at the end of the day, we're going to focus on us, right? That's a nationalistic tendency. It's a nationalistic, swing relative to the large globalism we see. Now here I want to ask a question. Which one's biblical? Get just the mic. No, you're good.
Both and.
Okay. Elaborate.
That's my all-time answer.
Yep.
I think that you are, there's a pattern all throughout Scripture of recognizing being, part of God's people.
Yep.
So there's a oneness in that sense. And then also when we are, called to, align and unify with God and be sort of brought under, His fold just in general, even as an individual.
Yep.
You are one with Christ, one with the Spirit,
Yep.
And so I think that in both cases, you're aligning to a compass point outside of yourself, but you're meant to do it both with personal, individual responsibility and simultaneous, communal connectivity. And so if you're part of the body, but you're also a member,
Yep.
To me, it's hey, both and.
Yeah, and that's a perfect example, I think. You are an individual member, but you're also part of a body, right? We've got to include both elements, I think. Go ahead.
I could say, to me, globalism, the idea of everybody all being the same in one, won't truly work because you may have a common cause, but you go around the world, we are different. And I think that is one thing that even missionaries learn when you go into another country. You're there to teach Christ, but you can't change those people's individual environment or whatever because that's what they're raised with. Anything that's going to change is going to be from inward out and their attitude toward that. So to me, the idea of globalism all being one isn't really even, I don't think, possible.
Sure.
Except, she said, when you're going in, the idea is to teach about Christ and God, but you haven't changed each individual place. So that's not truly globalism.
Yeah. No, I like that. And to me, that emphasizes the continuum. Exactly.
I think the missionary example is perfect. Because,
It is.
Because the kingdom of God is for all humans.
Yes.
And it does, in a sense, is global.
Mm-hmm.
And if you talk to Christians or churches, the goal is, you look at the missionary movements in the 19th, 20th centuries, there's just, it doesn't matter they're different from me. What matters is that Christ has called me to them.
That's right.
And so I think that there's that sense of like cross-cultural bridging of, going across those like typical boundaries. Whereas if you are looking at like national defense and things like that, you can't just decide, we'll just be friends with everybody.
Right.
It doesn't, there's like a boundary there. But I think the church is a really good example, and especially in its like local incarnations, because the spirit of Christ, we read a book about people reaching tribes in Papua New Guinea growing up, and I think it was called The Peace Child or something like that. But they had all these like local traditions and cultural things that he was able to kind of retell the biblical story within to explain what God did for them.
Yes.
And I think that is because whereas if you go someplace and make all the people wear Western clothes and you build a white church, and that's not reincarnating like the mission of Christ in the local culture. The way it should be.
And these are perfect examples because you need to be able to distinguish between the cultural expressions of Christianity and the Christianity itself, right? And that's what missionaries have to learn when they're going to go, because they need to say this cultural expression, let me just give an example, a particular form of worship, for example, right, is a cultural expression. And I need to leave my cultural expression behind and say, no, the important thing is that we worship God. How would you guys do that here in your culture, right? And so if you go to a church in Africa, the worship is going to be very different than what you experience here, and that's good, right?
Well, and also kind of to understand their culture so that when they have questions you're trying to explain, you can explain it in a way that they understand it from things around them, not from our viewpoint here in America.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Yeah, go ahead.
I feel like this has a really cool heart application too,
Mhm.
because it fosters a lot of humility of just because this is the way that we do it here,
Yep.
doesn't mean we know how it's done elsewhere or if this is right or wrong. It might just be cultural. And so like I feel like, even in our own church context, like there have been times where there's been like tension between, are we supposed to express just as a family, or is there room for the church as a body with individual members and different ways that we steward said members? And like I remember that kind of being, a pain point that we experienced, but I think it had so much to do with this conversation of not understanding the spectrum of things and recognizing like it's not like about being right or wrong, it's about how can we do this both and as healthily as possible. And so I think it kind of, all of this discussion is really cool too, because a good takeaway for us is just recognizing like, man, at the end of the day, like how can we relate to other people and try to step in or understand like maybe where they're at on the spectrum and why we're missing each other.
Yeah.
So.
No, I think that's really good. And, I just want to bring up a couple examples on this. Like, again, we're just utilizing the categories as helpful categories in which to talk about things. But if you look at the Good Samaritan, for example, you can see the whole point of that story is that he sees the common humanity of the individual, even though he's from a different national background or socioeconomical, position, right? He's in that sense, we're being lauded for having this common humanity sense. In this sense, we're all the same in that we're all created in the image of God. But then if you look at something like the book of Revelation, I think this is very powerful, and I love this. It's so important in the book of Revelation that people are saved from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. They maintain their national identity, their individuality, and that is a celebration expression of the diversity of humanity that God brings to the table. And so both are extremely important to hold. And again, we have tendencies as human beings to overswing the pendulum in one direction or another, just accept this position or just accept that position, when in reality, you can see the rich nuance that Scripture provides because it demonstrates our common humanity, but not in a naive way, because it also recognizes there's true evil out there, and there are human beings who have aligned themselves with the forces of evil, and in a fallen world, you have to be careful surrounding that, and yet there's also this rich love that God has for human beings of every expression, right? And so that's what we're trying to navigate when it comes to, again, these two positions that, in my opinion, rest on a continuum. This to me is like the fundamental problem in the West, is that we've just done this, and we've said, pick one. Pick one. Which one's right? And that's all we do, right? And again, our social media culture now has shifted that Overton window to where the most radical expressions are the ones that get the most clicks, get the most views, and you build an echo chamber, you build a silo where you just are mutually reinforced in your own radical position, rather than recognizing that God has created the world with a both-and structure or build.
I was going to say, we're a church body. We're all here because we're part of Christ. But we're still all different individuals. We all have different ideas. We go home, we do things differently. But you accept that because we are individuals. We're together in Christ and worshiping Him. But we still remain individuals in things that we do. And you just accept that because we all belong to Christ. That's the important thing.
That's right. And again, I think the emphasis on the individual, I do not think that this is some fallen, degradation of Western society and culture. I actually think this is a fundamental Christian idea. It really is radically in the New Testament scriptures where you get such an emphasis on personal relationship with Christ through repentance and faith. It's not absent in the Old Testament, but it certainly isn't emphasized like it is in the New. And so, rightly understood and situated, I think that individual emphasis is good. And I'm proud of that heritage as a Protestant, that we emphasize that. Your individual faith, you're not going to get to heaven on the back of your pastor's faith. You got to have a relationship with Christ for yourself. I think that's absolutely essential. It's good. Jesus emphasizes it. Can it go wrong? Sure. But we can go wrong in the other direction too. The real question is, how can we get the proper tension of both and hold them together, right? Hold them together. One final question I wanted to ask is prompted by 121. He's talking about communities, and what do we do now with the internet? Right? He says this. He says, the use of the word community for these various groups indicates both the collapse of traditional notions of belonging and the rise of a vast and growing number of alternative ways of human beings imagining their relationship to those around them. When identity is grounded in psychology and the internet allows for indulgence of any and all means of thinking about that identity, the concept of community lacks any real solidity. People can now pick and choose their communities, and that means that they can pick and choose their identities. So I want to end with one simple question. What is community now?
I think humans are storytellers about their own lives, about others' lives, about history, and there's a sense in which our meaning is derived from the story that we tell about ourselves. So I think the sort of like this new way of finding belonging is, what story am I assuming about my group of people, and how does that relate us to each other and the rest of the world? And in some ways, there's very much like this dichotomous setup where you're saying, not only does it tell me who belongs to me, it sets me over and against the other people.
I know who the enemy is also.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And so I think that kind of storytelling can lend itself to the sort of militant sense of meaning and giving purpose and stuff. And those stories, instead of uniting, like he's talking about post-World Wars, how like people from across the country who didn't know each other were fighting alongside each other for some shared values that united them. And I think that broader sense of shared values isn't really there anymore.
Yeah.
Those stories have changed.
Other thoughts?
Does the word community really have the same meaning now that it did at one time? Because I could think of community, and it didn't even mean you could belong to umpteen different churches or no church or whatever. But if there was a need or something come together, they work together for the common good of a person or whatever. I don't know. I don't see that much in like a community to where, I don't know, maybe I'm seeing things wrong, but I don't see that much that like we used to have.
I think you're right. I think communities are, if you want to use that word, and to your point, it might not even be the right word anymore, are much more fair weather. You know what I mean? Like, people can come and go. You can, live alongside somebody for years and years and years, it seems, and then, boom, they're gone, and there's almost no connection, and that sort of thing can happen too. So yeah, go ahead.
And that's why I like what we call a church community. We're all different and separate, but we have a common goal and a common good, and we look out and we care for one another. And there used to be a time where that community could be outside the church. You could have a larger,
Yes,
and
your neighbors.
now it's like,
yeah.
oh, I'm here and I'm there, and we don't work together.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, I think you're onto something.
Yeah, to piggyback off of you, Shirley, I feel like a lot of what new community is pulled towards is who helps me feel like I'm discovering myself. And I think before that was the main emphasis, it was almost like what makes us all feel human together for a cause. And so the church was not out of step necessarily because it felt like, oh, that's a cause place, and the military, that's another cause place, where we feel like we have a mission outside of ourselves, and it's for the greater good. But now the greatest good is self-actualization and identity discovery. And so I think that's also why community is so flippant as well now. You can literally move through 5 different types of community in a minute online based on, well, they don't affirm, my turtle pronoun, so let me find the turtle pronoun people. And not only do they have to affirm turtle pronoun, but I want it to be, specifically non-binary or this or that, or maybe you're a game grouper and it's got to be Euros all the way, VTOL only, you can find your niche, and the goal is, do I feel the most known? And I think that's not, I think what you would have if we were having a conversation with somebody who might really resonate with the newest form of community, they would say, well, wouldn't self-knowing be the greatest common good for everybody, though? If everybody just knew themselves, wouldn't we all just love better, et cetera? And I think it's just a ideal that's doesn't account for the fall and the impact on the human heart and how we can just choose self without any balancing force, without God's intervention. And so I think that's maybe the shift that I'm seeing is the greater good being human flourishing or security or protection or guarding something about humanity that feels like you're aligning with the battle of light and dark, and you're doing something that feels sacrificially outside of yourself. And now it's sacrifice everything for the self is what it feels like. That's what communities are supposed to do. It's supposed to be the place where you have to sacrifice the least so you can know yourself the most, which is ironic because you end up not knowing yourself.
Right.
It's just a vacuum.
That sense of loyalty, generosity, sacrifice for others is almost lost or gives way, right? And I do want to reemphasize, you just reminded me of something. I said this in lesson 1. It's as true now as it was, what was it, months and months ago now when we started. I've got no problem with the shift towards individualism. I got a problem with a shift towards individualism that does not have a robust doctrine of sin that goes along with it. And I think that's where the majority of the problem comes into play here, because there's no recognition that individualism can get very selfish and be sinful. I think it's good for all of us to find, as individuals, what Christ in me looks like, because I do think properly done, it's going to express itself differently for each and every one of us, tribe, tongue, people, and nation, right? There's the diversity. But so many that want to in the West run towards a more subjective frame. They don't believe in original sin. They don't believe that they have problems and they need to change and transform and be sanctified. And so it makes this whole shift to me go off the rails. I got no problem with the fundamentals underneath it. I got a problem with they forget about sin, right? So, yes.
I'm not sure if this is true, but he says that a world where the old forms of belonging have been dramatically weakened and new forms of community have gained imaginative traction. I wonder if these communities we have, like the LGBTQ community or the Nordic ski community, or those real things that people talk about,
Yes,
and it's they're products of technology and the internet, and that's kind of his point. Is he's saying it's like the weekend, the church, nation, family, like those have been weak, and people still need to feel like they're a part of a community, so then they gravitate towards these other things. And I'm wondering if that's kind of like a tool of Satan almost, to like give people this false sense of community. Like, oh, I am in the LGBTQ community, and then they kind of conjure up in their minds like that community would do the things a community does, sacrifice for me or care about me, when in reality it's actually just like a figment of their imagination. And so the church community is like the one bastion in the world, maybe, where it's like, no, this is actually what community is. We do life together, we sacrifice for one another, we're there, good times and bad. And if like that's something that the church needs to almost push back, and it's not, or I guess on the other side of that continuum would be God's intention with the internet was, now you can have communities all over the place. You don't even have, like, I don't really know that, but I sort of have this idea that maybe Truman is making a good point, that those things have actually been weakened. These new things that have emerged are not good, really. And they're kind of messing with us because as humans, we have this need to be in community, and it's almost like it's the Zoom call version. It's like, oh, this is kind of easy. I can just be in this community.
It's like
I don't have to
saccharin
commit
instead
much.
of sugar.
Yeah,
It's like fooling you.
Yeah, I don't have to commit much to be a part of this community. Well, it's not even really a community, you know.
Yeah, so I have some thoughts on this. I think largely what is lacking in them is the element of sacrifice for the sake of others. The element of, yes, exactly right. And you see this in these communities. I've mentioned this before in this study, but look at anyone who is detransitioned. They get dropped like a bad habit, right? And immediately, because of the tribalized nature and the fact that there's no middle ground and we can't have conversations about this, if somebody detransitions, now you're a grifter, you're just fighting for the other side, you have turned against us, and essentially there's
no grace.
There's no grace whatsoever, right? And no room for somebody to be of a different disposition or predilection on that. And so in those senses, I would call them faux communities, right? But I will say this, I don't think that's true of necessity. And I'll give an example. I had an individual who regularly watches my content, who I met online, come visit us here in Leadville. I had lunch with him. He attended our church. We have conversations about my service. That's real community, but it's because he put skin in the game. You see what I mean? He made it.
Called you up.
Yeah, that's exactly right. He made it live and breathe and move. And so in that sense, I think that's a way that internet communities can be redeemed. There are some people who regularly watch our content online that while you don't know them, they are with us every Sunday, and they live thousands of miles away from us, right? And so, again, I think that is a way, like, don't get me wrong, I think the tendency can absolutely be towards faux communities, and you got to be really careful, because at the end of the game, there is no true, sacrifice. That's exactly right. But I don't think that's true of necessity. I think as the world shrinks, I think it is a way we can connect closer with our brothers and sisters across the world. I'll just give an example. The Pinnells, Josh. I quoted Warren Austin Gage on Sunday. He turned me on to him. I didn't know about him before that, right? Josh Pinnell, he came out here, we talked. He's across the world now, right? And we support them, but we have some skin in each other's game, right? And like, he encouraged me towards that, and our communication is facilitated by technology. So it can be good. It absolutely can be fake, and it's saccharin, not sugar, right? So you got to be really careful.
I was going to say, the people who listen regularly,
Yes.
in a way, they maybe are doing a sacrifice that they take the time to set aside to listen to you on a Sunday or later, and they don't just, turn it off. That there's something that they're getting out of it, and so in a way, it's a sacrifice to give that time to do that, even if we never totally meet them in person.
Yep.
Just a thought.
Yes.
Because sacrifice can mean a lot of different things.
Yeah.
I think the hard thing with that, though, is that if I don't know them, how do I have community with them? You know what I
It's
mean?
true.
Where it's like,
Just
to
be
have
two-way.
community, right, it has to be two-way, or all the people are interacting with one another for that to actually work. Because otherwise, that person might feel like they're part of our community,
Right.
but no one even knows that. so how do we know if they're struggling that we do need to step in
Yeah.
to help or whatever those kinds
Absolutely. And these are the hard questions, when we talk about dual membership and different things like that. These are all the sorts of things that come up.
I really got to add one thing to this because Christy has said this before too. Like with Facebook, she doesn't. It's like we're humans designed to be able to keep track of 1,000 people or whatever. And I've kind of said, oh no, this is great. Like I have a lot of high school friends. I can like actually stay in touch with them. I feel even if it's one message here or there. It's like this is real. This is what we can do. And that's almost like the point I feel here, where it's the same thing. It's just like, the question is almost, do we have this capacity for that type of a community?
Right.
Because I don't deny the very real side, and like the channel, I had a similar experience with someone like my podcast. I'm like, wow, this is a real person. I'm like skiing with this guy, and like we have the same thought process, and we work same. Yeah, it's like he's in the cedarskier.com community, right? And I'm like really face to face with him, but at the same time, yeah, where we designed to kind of have this mass. I can be a part of this community, this community, this community, and my investment is actually like listening to something or donating. But it seems real. I don't know.
No, it's one of those things where I think you get out of it what you put into it type of thing, and you have to have other people who are willing to invest, if that makes sense. Because I'll flip this the other direction too. There, in our day and age, in our society, in our culture, you can have face-to-face, in-person community with people, and then drop off the face of the earth. There's a church I attended when I was in Reno going to school for like 4.5 years, and it was super influential on me. I was visiting Reno for work, and I popped in to talk to people, and it was like, who are you? You know, like what? And it was like, I did face-to-face community with you guys for years. You were super influential on my walk, and there is almost nobody here who even recognized me or remember me, anything,
Well,
right?
that goes to the transitory nature.
That's exactly right.
Community
But it's all
space.
connected.
Yeah.
That's also a technological advancement, right?
Mobility of people.
Yep, 100%.
I had a couple of, we were talking, because I think part of this community conversation goes back to, like, the left idealizing the Good Samaritan, trying to make that, like, the global aim,
Yes.
versus and you mentioned this too, just like this assumption about human nature.
Yep.
That there is, I think Solzhenitsyn said, like, the line of good and evil runs through all our hearts. And so to assume as a nation that there's no one who wants to take advantage of people out there,
Right.
and abuse power, is foolish.
Yep.
On one side. But then as individuals, our call to be locally aware of people who are in need.
Yes.
Like there's almost like at the highest level, you have to protect yourself. I think Churchill said democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other ones we've tried from time to time.
Right.
And so like it's bad because like it doesn't necessarily promote equality. There's lots of problems. But at the same time, like we can see human nature and say human nature tends to abuse power when given that opportunity.
Yep.
So we can create these high-level constructs that protect people, but then at the lower levels, engage in that person-to-person, Good Samaritan, humane, like community.
Yeah, sure. No, I think it's really valuable. And again, anything that encourages the both and is what I'm about, right? And we've got to thoughtfully figure out how to engage that. So, good. And Shirley.
Talking about, others. When my kids were little, I took them to a joy club, Jesus, others, and you. And the idea was other people come before you. Now, I realize we have to be smart about that. I mean, you can't let people run over you and you never take care of yourself and everything. But the idea is you should be thinking about others before you do yourself. And they started that, I think it was like 3 years old. And it was, they really enjoyed it.
Yep.
And they then went, the leader then would take them and they'd go around to the different houses there in town. We were living in Gilman and visit the elderly. They do things for people. It was just showing you have to think about others sometimes. It's not always just you and just me.
Yep.
And it was a really good program.
Oh, I can imagine, because I think as human beings, that's how we're fundamentally built, and that's where we find the greatest joy and satisfaction in life. And the problem is, because of the fall, we've twisted things into the exact opposite, right? YOJ. You know what I mean? Like, and so yeah, there you go, right? And so I think that's absolutely essential. It's huge, and really that simple tool for young children gets to the heart of our problem as human beings, right? And we find our greatest true joy and satisfaction in truly serving others, right? So, yeah, it's great. Yeah, that's good. All right, we've gone a little bit over time. I appreciate everyone's engagement and involvement in tonight's study. Again, I think the continuum matters. The line, behold a line, and that's right. And it's an ideal line. So I'm going to go ahead and pray for us, and we'll close. Father, we thank you for your grace and mercy. We thank you for all that you've done for us, Lord, and we ask that you would help us, Lord, this week as we seek to truly live for you and for your glory. Please continue to conform us, shape us, mold us into the image of Christ, and help us to live for you with all that we've got. We thank you for all your grace and mercy. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. You're dismissed. Thank you.